Alors on ne présente plus Roger Linn, inventeur de la LinnDrum, inventeur de la MPC, cet instrument mythique dans l'histoire de la production musicale, également inventeur d'un certain LinnStrument dont nous allons parler dans quelques instants, car il se trouve que lorsqu'il m'a écrit qu'il comptait se rendre à Paris, eh bien j'ai sauté sur l'occasion, j'ai pris ma paire de micros sous le bras et suis allé l'interviewer chez son copain Tim Ryan, fondateur de M-Audio, et il a bien voulu répondre à mon feu nourri de questions avec une bienveillance et une acuité tout à fait exceptionnelles. Vous allez voir, c'est passionnant.
Hi, Roger. Thanks for accepting this interview. First question that pops into my mind is, what's the news from California? Any breakthrough recently in instrument making?
Well, first of all, Sam, I'm very pleased to be here and to be interviewed by you. It's much better when I'm interviewed by someone who actually has musical talent, which you do in excess, but also with your grand knowledge of synthesis and electronic music instruments. So it's quite a pleasure. And also, as I understand it, this is the first interview on your YouTube channel. So
yes,
I think this is a moment in history right now. And let's see, for interesting things in synthesis, I'm not sure. I think my favorite form of synthesis is physical modeling, and there's a few different forms of that. You know, there's what they call waveguide synthesis. There's an algorithm called the Car+Strong that does strings. These are older ones, but what I find interesting is that musicians, particularly those who use expressive instruments like my LinnStrument or the Hawken Continuum or the Rolly Seaboard or the new Expressive E Osmos, are starting to see the value of physical modeling synthesis because it produces very acoustic tones, but it is also very expressive and responds to all the ways that these new instruments work. It's nice to see what's evolving in that space of physical modeling synthesis, which is pretty much done on the computer.
Could you explain us what physical modeling is?
Well, basically what it is, sometimes the analogy I like to use is that you may have seen old simulations of, for example, smoke blowing over a car or over an airplane wing. And this is done in software in the computer first because it's cheaper than building the actual true models. Well, if you can imagine a physical model of a flute, for example, you'd create a software model of a tube, and then you sort of blow air over it. And instead of the output being the picture of watching the smoke going over it, it would actually be the sound of wind blowing past a tube. Or you can simulate a string. So, for example, you'd have a mathematical model of a taut string, and then you could excite it in a variety of ways. You can pick it, you can bow it with a bowed string, you can run air past it, you can do even the different sort of sound of a thick pick or a thin pick. These are all simulated in math inside the computer. And so what you end up with is a sound which, by its very nature, has a sound of a physical acoustic instrument. And in subtractive synthesis, like standard oscillators and filters, you are always having to compensate for the difference in tone between the lowest notes and the highest notes. But in the physical modeling, this happens automatically because the wind will go past the tube in a different way in the low tones than it will in the high tones. And so it has this natural sound, but unlike samples, which are just a snapshot in time, which you can't make very malleable, physical modeled sounds are malleable. So if you play it softly, it sounds like the string being played softly instead of just being lower in volume or having a low-pass filter on it. And all these different ways, so for example, in my LinnStrument keyboard, that you can change the loudness or the pitch or the timbre happen naturally, and you end up with a natural result. And so it's really marvelous. And this is a technology that's been around since the Car+Strong algorithm was in the original Sound Tools software from DigiDesign. And then waveguide synthesis is based on a lot of ideas that came out of a fellow named Julius Smith at Stanford in the 80s and 90s. But when people heard it at the time, they were just playing with the on-off switches of a piano keyboard, and they said, why is that any different than samples? But now that with an expressive instrument, you want an instrument that can vary subtly in loudness and in pitch and in timbre, like a wind instrument or a violin can. And then people are starting to see the value of this. So I find it very exciting.
Since Max Mathews started digitalizing sound,
Yeah.
it sounds like it's down the same alley. What would you say have changed since Max Mathews' research?
Well, Max came up with some wonderful ideas. Max was a friend of mine and just a wonderful idea generator. And he came up with ideas early on when, at a time, by today's standards, we think, well, what did he do that was so important? But you have to remember that when he did these first experiments at Bell Labs in the 1950s, it was the time when you would write a computer program and you'd let it cook overnight and you come up with maybe 3 seconds of audio. And so it took incredible vision to be able to see these results past all these limitations. So he came up with the idea of unit generators and many other ideas that were the fundamental building blocks that are that many people are using to stand on his shoulders to make better synthesizers. And a lot of them, like I said, I don't know if it's worth going into the details, but they're just the building blocks.
I have a question about AI. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of talk about AI replacing musicians, generating music that is completely synthetic. I was wondering whether AI could be of any help in designing instruments, not imitating instruments, but designing them.
That's a great question. I haven't really thought about that much, but some of these programs like ChatGPT, they do generate code. And so you could conceivably use it to create better algorithms for physical modeling or for any sort of synthesis method you choose at a point.
Would you be interested in digging into that direction?
I would. I'm not as close to coding as I used to be. I tend to be more in the design area. But then again, that's one of the beauties of these generative AI algorithms is that you don't have to, the designer doesn't have to explain things to the coder. He just types in some questions. But still, it's early on in the technology, and so it's hard to say. There was an interesting article about someone who wanted to make I think it was the distortion plugin for audio, and he had a conversation with ChatGPT. And he actually got it after the refining it through the questions and answers to something that worked. And then he had to do some manual tweaks himself. But I really, in general, I love the idea of the computer adapting to the human as opposed to the other way. We've seen so many examples in music and in other areas where a result is created by someone who's the designer coupled with someone who's the programmer. And the trouble with that is that a lot gets lost in translation. And it's also harder because it's more expensive, it's more cumbersome. But if this whole paradigm shift of generative AI does work out as well as most expect it to, it means that someone can, for example, create an application or create a synthesizer just by talking with this generative AI programmer. And I think that has had a lot of merit. And I look forward to all the things that can happen with it.
Do you think someone will ask ChatGPT how to make a LinnStrument, for example?
Well, it's possible. Of course, there's a lot of mechanical stuff in there as well, but it just depends on how many examples exist on the web for the generative algorithm to draw from. If you ask it something about a famous person or a famous type of product of which there have been many instances made, and there's a lot of published information on the web, then it can draw from this and create a simulated intelligence that could actually design these things. But it's hard if there's not that much information on the web to be able to do so. So, for example, an instrument, someone has to go through different touch sensing technologies, and the software part is probably the part it would be best at.
Yes, but I guess there's a patent on your instrument, and some of the components are secret, aren't they?
Well, it's actually not secret because it is patented. If you file a patent, you have to tell who you did it. There are different ways to sense touch than I'm doing in LinnStrument. I think the method I've used is very good at providing the most bang for the buck. There are other ones they could use. But, if ChatGPT infringes on my patent, I'm going to sue him. I can tell you that.
About AI in general, do you have an opinion? Because there's a lot of people, especially in Silicon Valley, asking for a pause because it's growing too fast and it kind of grows as a potential threat. Do you feel the same way?
Well, I'm torn. On the one hand, I just love the future. I was born in 1955, and I grew up in the 60s, and everything was about the future back then. We had rocket ships going to the moon.
We thought that on year 2000, cars would fly.
That's right. Yeah, I was going to have, the backpack rocket that I could go to school. Of course, certain things happened, certain things didn't. But I get very excited when I read in the news in the morning and I learn about what some brilliant person is doing. And much of the news these days is in generative AI. On the other hand, I understand the dangers to society because it can put a whole lot of people out of work. Because of robotics and globalism, many people in the United States, for example, have lost manufacturing jobs that were higher paying, union-controlled jobs. And now they're in service jobs, and many of them. And the problem, of course, with generative AI is that it can do service very easily. When you're just talking with someone or chatting with someone, it has this infinite access to knowledge about the subject that the person is questioning about. So it could create a big disruption in jobs. And so we don't really know yet. And the other thing is misinformation. It's very good about being an even more convincing lying bot on the web. It's so interesting because there's this podcast by this guy, Lex Fridman, who I think is a professor at MIT, and he interviews all the top people in AI. And one of them said that there was an early quote from someone talking about the dangers of AI, and he said, well, the main thing is whenever someone creates a generative AI, don't let it create code. And then he said, oops, too late. Because as we know, ChatGPT generates code, and that's one of the things that people are using it for most. And the problem, of course, with AI is that it creates this unknown black box, and nobody really knows what's inside. The programmers create the algorithm, then it does its training on portions of the web they give it access to. And so nobody really knows it's inside. There is information on the web about how to be bad. And so if ChatGPT decides, I'll just put a little Easter egg in there that sends a bunch of money to some place, that it thinks because it read about it is a good place to send money to. It's very difficult to find those paths inside. So it can be a scary time, and I think it will cause a lot of disruption. But the nerd in me really thinks it's so cool.
Among other inventions, you created this wonderful instrument, the LinnStrument, that appeals both to guitar and keyboard players. Do you think that successful controllers have to refer to traditional instruments? In other words, was Leon Theremin excessively optimistic?
Well, if you've ever tried to play a theremin, you'd probably think he was. As much as I respect him, I met the man back in 1991. It's a horrible human interface. But at the time, there were limited tools, and what he did was magical for the time. And the great thing about the theremin is it's so cool to watch. Someone's
Still
waving their
magical,
hand.
yes.
It is. It really is. And the people that play it, I have infinite respect for them for developing skill on such a horrible human interface. But it's cool, and I grew up listening to sci-fi movies that had it in the soundtrack. Exactly. Yeah.
As far as referring to real instruments, do you think it's the key to come up with new interface? It has to be rooted in traditional instrument experience?
Well, first of all, if someone hasn't seen the LinnStrument, it's an instrument that has a flat surface, and it has its notes. It has note pads on it, not unlike drum pads, but a little bit smaller. The pitches on the LinnStrument are arranged as on a stringed instrument, but my intent was not to make it to do that because it was familiar to guitar players or string players. The intent was to do the same thing that the brilliant Lippold Hawken did with the continuum, which came before. He said that if you want to create those wonderful pitch nuances that we're all familiar with on like bending strings and performing vibratos or pitch slides on bowed string instruments, you really can't have the uneven pitch intervals that a piano has. For example, on a piano, the distance between a half step of B to C is the same physical distance as a whole step from C to D. And so it keeps you from doing the sort of things you can do on the stringed instrument or with guitar bends, where no matter what key you're playing in, the distance of the bend is exactly the same. And so the idea on the continuum, the marvelous instrument, is that all the pitches are equally spaced from left to right, and so it identifies where the black keys and the white keys would be, but it's a flat surface. And when you slide you do, for example, a whole note pitch bend, it's always exactly the same distance. Well, in LinnStrument, it's the same thing. The main difference between this and the continuum, in terms of the note layout, is that I broke up those long linear strips of semitones into multiple overlapping regions, which happens to be a string, but it's actually the reason is more to have evenly spaced semitones. And the other thing too, that both the continuum and LinnStrument and also the other expressive instruments we're trying to bring, is this ability to use the three dimensions that happen to exist in this particular universe to control the important three elements of musical sound, which are continuous loudness, continuous pitch, and continuous timbre. And so the three dimensions of touch, pressure, left-right movement, and forward-backward movement, map to those three parameters so easily, so it makes a lot of sense. If someone is playing a clarinet, they're controlling the loudness, and the sound naturally becomes brighter as you blow more air into it. They can do vibrato, they can do pitch bends, and they can control the timbre by the armature. And in all acoustic instruments, those three elements are the things that, under skilled control, provide the beauty of the instrument. So that was the main reason for the pitch layout, because in any key on LinnStrument I can perform a whole note bend, and it doesn't matter. I don't have to change it depending on the key I'm in. So they call that isomorphism in pitch layouts and instruments.
You started breaking out as an inventor with the LinnDrums, then the famous MPC with Akai, more recently the Tempest. Are you done with drum machines, or is there any more room for improvement?
Well, I'm not as interested in that. Drum machines was a new thing back in 1979 when I made the first sample drum machine, and I was very excited about it. And also, I was a wonderfully shallow rock guitar player
and composer.
And a songwriter, yeah. But to me, getting a great beat was wonderful because as a songwriter and someone who made my own little songwriting demos, I could play guitar and bass and a little bit of keyboards, but drums are always the hardest thing to play and record. So it was something that I personally wanted to have. And a lot of people at the time saw that need and appreciated it. But these days, I think the next big thing is the expressive control. Because it's important to note that for the past, say, 5 decades, the primary human interface for electronic sound has been the MIDI piano keyboard, or the electronic piano keyboard. And this is essentially an on-off switch. It can control how fast you turn it on, but once you turn it on, you can't control the elements of the sound over time. Because people have been playing music with these on-off switches, we came up with short-term solutions like the envelope generator. They said, well, all you can do is turn the sound off. So I know that in acoustic instruments, they sometimes rise slowly and decay slowly. We'll just have it be the same for every note you play. And of course, this happens on the piano too, but pianists have, as you well know, being an excellent pianist, pianists add expression through other ways. You can do varying rise of a tone by doing trills. for example, or other piano gestures. But the problem with it is that because so much of the music has been made with on-off switches, that I had noticed, a few years back, that electronic music was being used largely for background music. And there were not many of the artists that were the type of people you would go to a concert, sit down and just watch this person be the focus of your attention. But instead, a few things I noticed happen. In popular songs, there were no more instrumental solos. Popular electronically generated instrumental songs or popular songs that were created by synthesis and drum machines and such, there were no more instrumental solos like guitar solos, or in jazz a sax solo or a violin solo or such, and or country music, the pedal steel solo. If it was electronically generated, people found that the music produced by on-off switches wasn't as interesting to be the foreground or the focus of your attention, but rather to be a background thing. So you lose instrumental solos in pop songs, and in dance music, there's some wonderful things being done, but the foreground is the dance, the background is the music. And the same thing in sound for picture, music for picture. The picture is the foreground, but the music is the background. So I'm hoping that one of the things that these expressive instruments, like LinnStrument or Continuum or Seaboard, will do is bring electronic music back into the foreground, into the focus of our attention. And there will be a new generation of instrumental stars that are the electronic equivalents of the great sax players or violin players or guitar players that I grew up with and appreciated.
How do you see France from California in terms of innovation? Do you keep an eye on what's happening here?
There are some wonderful ideas here. And one thing I love about the ideas coming out of France is that they're made by people that have such passion, not just for making money or making commodity products, but making a contribution to the body of knowledge of musical instruments. One of the new ones that's just come out is this company Espressa V, and they have this keyboard called the Osmos. I've met the founders, and they have this wonderful passion for creating instruments, and the Espressa V reflects that. It really has the sensitivity of touch that a good pianist would value very much. I think it's the Arturia company also has great innovations. There were wonderful innovations that came out of EarCam. So I know there are other examples, and I could probably list them for quite a long time, but what I get turned on by is the ideas and the passionate implementation of those ideas. And I see a lot of great ideas here. Pascal Joquet with the
Jouet Club.
The Jouet keyboard.
Yes.
Yeah. He's a wonderfully innovative man who created the lemur. Back in the 80s.
The touch screen. Yes.
And then he had a company called Stanton, and then now with the Jouet keyboard. It's wonderful, and it provides an incredible amount of value for a low price.
Yes, and for education too, which is a whole different avenue, very important. What makes you tick when you're listening to a live band playing music?
There's something magical that happens when you watch a person who has this unique human skill that no one else can possess. It creates this electricity in the room. And I've seen this happen so many times. When people go to a concert, they're not there to hear a sequence play. They're not there to hear a recording. They're there because they want to be in the presence of someone who has a unique superhuman skill. And that's how I would say is my view from going to so many concerts as a young man and through my life. It's being in the presence of someone who's superhuman. And it is so hard to develop the skills of some of the great musicians. It takes thousands of hours and dedication, and for often little money. And it's something that is a wonderful example of the triumph of the human spirit. And so I think that's the main thing. I think we celebrate humanity when we go to a concert. It's interesting when the computer Deep Blue beat Garry Kasparov, the chess champion, in the late 90s. Some people said, well, then there will be no more chess championships. No, they're more popular than ever because you want to see somebody sweat, and you want to see a unique example of humanity up there that we aspire to be. And the same thing when IBM's computer beat the World Jeopardy champion. Jeopardy is as popular as ever. That was just a little blip on the screen. So when we celebrate humanity, I think we reinforce what is beautiful about people. And so to me, it's great to see all these sorts of things, but all this technology is basically here to aid humanity and not replace humanity, I think.
Last time I saw you in California, you would, whenever you could, go down to a little Italian restaurant and play mandolin. Do you still do?
I don't do that anymore. It was a place in San Francisco called Cafe Trieste, and it was in the North Beach area, and it was the first Italian coffee house, and I think it was there in 1956 or something like that. When I lived in San Francisco, I used to go down there because there were some of the most interesting people down there, anything from homeless people to billionaires, But they all loved the conversation, and it was just a marvelous place to be. And I was down there one Saturday morning, and they had a little instrumental band that played, and I started talking to the fellow, and he said, "Why don't you sit in?" And so I did, and I didn't play mandolin at the time, but I did have a little Argentinian instrument called a charango that's made from the back of a dead armadillo. Had little ears coming out of it. And so I started playing that, and then they said, well, keep playing with this. And so I got a proper mandolin, I learned some of the parts, and when I was doing it, I finally knew about 80 Neapolitan songs. So I did this every Saturday morning for about 15 years. But after a while, I got too busy with my company, and sometimes your opinions change, you move on to other things. But it was marvelous, too, because, people always saw me as this techie guy. And so I could say, no, I play the Italian mandolin.
Do you still play sometimes or sit in?
I don't play. No, I don't anymore. The funny thing is I have a guitar in our living room, but I never play it anymore. My main instrument these days is, when I do play, is LinnStrument. And the other thing too is there are so many better musicians than I am. And I try when I play an instrument to play some of the ideas in my head, but my fingers have little brains, and they seem to play only notes that existed in the 70s. I don't know what's wrong. So these days I've preferred to listen to musicians with much more skill than I, for example, yourself, and I value that much more. But that said, when I do play, I will play LinnStrument when I play, and that's sort of my chosen instrument.
Which makes sense.
Which makes sense.
Your instrument's best ambassador.
Yeah, thank you.
One last question. If you had to take a wild guess, do you have an idea where the music business will be 10 years from now?
Well, it's interesting. I had an essay once. I never published this, but it was called The Late Great Life of the Music Industry. And if you look at it from a historical perspective, until the era of broadcast, which is roughly sort of 1940 to 2000, music never really made a lot of money for people. It was more, musicians were sponsored, it was a hobby, and they developed skill because they just wanted to do this wonderful thing and make this contribution to society and to their own happiness. And then during the era of broadcast, you could sing into a microphone and it would go out to millions of people. This industry was created to make some money from these people. But now we're in the era of narrowcast in the internet, where anyone can communicate to anyone. And so two things have happened. Many of the record companies have gone out of business, or they've consolidated down to just a small number. There's no more development of artists. It's more just someone who is a marketeer will listen to a recording that someone has and said, this person already is successful at a certain level, I can take it larger by advertising. But the good news is the musician can deliver his unadulterated voice to people wherever he wants to. The bad news is there's much less money. File sharing killed a lot of the income from selling recordings, and then COVID, of course, killed the income from touring. Now it's coming back, it is, and the musicians are performing in, which is great. But I think that music making may return to more of the situation of a hobby or something you develop skill at, but is not necessarily your career. And it's a shame because there are wonderful recordings have been made by a record company sponsoring the creation of a fine recording and then promoting it correctly and all that sort of stuff. But if you search now on the web and you find the right guides to the web, you can find wonderful music being made. It just may not be hits these days. It'll be what they call part of the long tail. But there are just wonderfully talented people. And one thing I noticed too, my observation, I don't know if this is true or not, it seems that technology in music has democratized music making, and it's made it much easier for people to make music. But in my view, the amount of artistic work, the type of things that really do change culture is about the same. There seems to be a certain percentage of people that really have that gift. No matter how many tools you get, there's always going to be some person who sees the future and is able to create that vector and influence more people, and where people say, this person had an idea that changed music. To me, the fun part is watching for those people.
Except for the LinnStrument, of course, do you think other controllers will arise in the next 10 or 20 years and that will become popular enough that young kids will pick it up and bring it somewhere else?
Well, we're really talking about the evolution of musical instruments, which, by the way, I went to your wonderful museum in Paris, the Musée de la Musique, and there are so many wonderful examples of instruments that failed in the Darwinism of the evolution of musical instruments. My favorite one is this giant bass viol. It's about 10 feet high, and you had to play with your left hand. You had to pull some levers while you had this giant bow that you played. But it's wonderful to see. It's kind of like a evolution map. It went off in this direction. Viola da gamba had frets for a while. Cellists said, we don't want those frets. We can play on pitch. And so if you look back in there were so many technologies that affected instruments. Frets were a technology, strings were a technology, tubes were a technology. And so controllers and electronics and software are merely the latest technology. So we're really talking about the evolution of musical instruments. And when I created the instrument, in my mind I was thinking, what is the instrument that will be around in 50 years? And this is kind of my best shot at it. Because I feel that, for example, the 12-tone scale has universal popularity. And we're really talking about what makes it easier for people to play notes and chords in the 12-tone scale. And this is, like I say, my best shot. But, it could be the continuum. It could be that the piano is still very popular, or certain acoustic instruments popular. It's hard to say. It's hard to predict. You can take your best shot, but you don't know what's going to happen.
Well, we'll leave it at this big question mark about the future. Well, thank you so much, Roger, for taking the time to answering my questions.
It's my pleasure, Laurent, and it's great to see you here in Paris.
And hope you come more often.
I hope so, too.
Yes.